Okay, so welcome again to this this media briefing for the long-term sustainability report. As Eddie said, this is the first long-term sustainability report the Fiscal Council has done. It's been a very long-term project. It's been something that we always wanted to do, and so we're very happy to be able to share it with you today. I'm joined on the media briefing by Council Member Michael McMahon, also by our Chief Economist and Head of Secretariat, Eddie Casey, and members of our Secretariat. And let me thank them again for their excellent work yet again on this project, and I look forward to sharing this report with you today. Briefly, as background, I think you're all familiar with the Fiscal Council as an official independent body with a mandate to assess the public finances. This first long-term sustainability report looks at challenges and risks to the public finances from 2025 to 2050. This analysis feeds into the Council's assessment of the fiscal stance, one of the key parts of our mandate. As you know, the Council has always taken the view that you can't really think about today's fiscal policy settings without thinking about the medium term and the longer term and taking those things into consideration. And though we have featured these things in our reports in the past, this is the first time that we've really undertaken a comprehensive analysis of these issues. So this is really one piece of the jigsaw being fitted into place in terms of our wider thinking about fiscal policy. Before I come to the key messages, let me just explain a little bit of context about the report. So this report looks at the budget situation beyond 2025. In the fiscal assessment report that was published a month ago, we looked explicitly at the period between now and 2025. As you'll recall, we had three scenarios given all the uncertainty around COVID-19. And the policy advice we gave at the time, it remains relevant today. So there are really three phases. The first phase is in terms of supporting businesses and individuals during the COVID crisis. The second phase is a period of sizable fiscal stimulus that will be required after that to support demand in the economy. And the third part is a period of fiscal adjustment, but not a return to austerity that would be required in the outer years of this period. So that frames the short term and out to 2025. This report looks beyond 2025, assuming that we reach 2025 in a reasonably good fiscal position, close to balance. So that's for context. So the key messages of this report out to 2025 are first that growth is likely to slow. And what's very clear is that the number of older people in the economy will increase very fast, and that will have important implications. Under current policies, spending growth would outstrip revenue growth, and that process would begin quite soon. And this would essentially be driven up by higher pension and by higher health costs. As a result, a large deficit would build up over time, particularly in the 2040s. And without policy action, the debt to GNI star ratio would fall more slowly than it would otherwise. It would reach a trough of around 90% of GNI star, but then it would begin to rise sharply, and it would reach 110% of GNI star by 2050, and it would be still rising at a rapid rate at that point. To ensure long-term fiscal sustainability and sustainability of our social systems and the system as a whole, tax and spending policies will need to adjust over time. One area of adjustment would be within pensions and within the pensions area itself, and allowing the pension age to rise broadly following life expectancy would be helpful in this regard, and including implementing the already legislated planned increases in the pension age. But more broadly, wider actions are likely to be required on tax and spending, and taking appropriate actions promptly would ultimately make this less costly, less disruptive, and would lead to a better outcome all around. Inevitably, with long-term projections, there is substantial uncertainty, and there are particular risks around COVID-19, interest rates, climate change, corporation tax, and health costs. Now, let me take you through the reasoning that lies behind these conclusions in a bit more detail. So the long-term sustainability report is based around a basic framework that has three layers. The first layer is a long-term model of economic growth, which is driven by productivity, which is driven around assumptions about the population and employment, and a number of other economic assumptions go into building an economic scenario. In the second layer, these economic assumptions are translated into the impact on revenue, and on expenditure, with a particular focus on expenditure in areas that are sensitive to aging, such as health and pensions, but also other areas like education and social protection. Then we take these revenue and expenditure projections under current policy settings, and we derive the policy balance and the implications for the debt ratio. So our model really has 3 layers to it, and we'll be showing that to you today, and that underpins the analysis that we have here. In terms of productivity, the economist Paul Krugman said that productivity isn't everything, but in the long run, it's almost everything. So that seems like an appropriate place to start thinking about long-term growth. One thing we know about productivity growth, which is shown in this chart, which shows regions across the OECD area, is that countries that start with higher productivity levels tend to have slower productivity growth. So as you move to the right, as you move to higher productivity, growth tends to be weaker. And as Ireland has caught up, that's reduced its potential for additional catch-up growth, and is a reason why we expect productivity growth to slow over the coming years. At the same time, both Irish and international trends seem to point to slower productivity growth. And so a key part of the projections and a key part of why growth slows is this slowing of productivity growth that we anticipate over the coming decades. But of course, there are many uncertainties associated with this. The other big factor is population aging. So in our projections, the population continues to increase, but it continues to increase particularly at older ages. So we see a number of factors working here. One is rising life expectancy. The second is that bigger age cohorts, bigger groups in the population will be reaching retirement age. We assume that fertility is broadly stable, but we see that migration will continue to help mitigate aging pressures, mostly because migrants are relatively young typically compared to the population as a whole, and so enter the working age population straight away. Looking a bit more carefully at the population, we see that there will be a large increase in the share of over 65s in the population. In fact, the share of over 65s in the population will increase from around 15% today to around 27% by 2050. This is a huge change. And you can see it in this chart. The green areas show the shares of the total population today. You can see that most people, in fact, the overwhelming majority of people, are under 65. But then if you compare it to this outlined area, which shows up as white at the top for 2050, you can see there's going to be a big increase in the share of those over 50, particularly if you look right at the top. The share of over 85-year-olds, which is expected to increase 4-fold over this period. And that's compensated by a reduction in the share of people basically around 40, 45. And this is the product of 2 things. First, it's the fact that life expectancy is actually increasing quite fast. Life expectancy at 65 is currently 85, so people can expect to be retired for just under 20 years at the moment. But by 2050, life expectancy at 65 will have increased to 90. So we will have gained 5 years life expectancy by that stage, which basically means that for every year goes by, people can expect another 2 months of life after the age of 65. The other effect that you see here is more people will be reaching retirement age. So if you look at this chart, this big bulge around 40, 45 corresponds to the peak in the number of births in Ireland, which is in about 1980. So that means there are a lot more people in that generation than there are in slightly later or slightly earlier generations. And you can also see their children of this big cohort who are somewhere around 10 today. So if you look at the numbers, there's about 40,000, 50,000 people retiring or reaching 65 every year at the moment. By 2040, that will peak around 80,000. So we have a doubling of the number of people reaching what might broadly be viewed as retirement age. One of the striking things about Ireland is its population aging is going to be relatively rapid. While Ireland starts being relatively young today, and you can see this on the chart on the right, where the green line is Ireland, the blue line is the EU average, and this is a measure of the share of elderly in the population. You can see Ireland is relatively young today at 2020, but it will age very rapidly. In fact, by 2035, in 15 years' time, Ireland will look very much like today's EU average in terms of aging. But within a generation, Ireland's population will be more elderly than any EU country is today. So this is a massive and unprecedented social change that Ireland faces. Taking those things together, so taking together the slower productivity growth and the fact that in an aging population, one with a lower birth rate compared to the past, labour will grow more slowly, you can see that growth is expected to slow over the coming years. There will be a period later in the decade where growth will still be relatively strong, but weaker than it has been in previous years. But by the late 2040s, 2050s, economic growth will be around 1% a year. This is far lower than the kind of norm of 3% that I think Ireland has been used to over past decades. Taking that in terms of its implications for fiscal policy, under current policies, spending growth would outstrip revenue. So as this chart shows, the green dots, which corresponds to revenue, basically would grow broadly in line with GNI star and would stay around 42%. And many spending items would also increase broadly in line with GNI star, so it wouldn't make a great deal of difference. However, some items, pensions and health, would grow faster than GNI star and faster than revenues. And so you can see as these dots tick up, the primary expenditure is pulling ahead of revenue, and a gap of around 5 percentage points would open up by 2050. This is a very big gap. It's a 10% gap in the levels. And this is basically driven by rising pension and healthcare costs. So this chart compares the current level, the darker dots, with the 2050 share of spending in GNI star. And according to our projections, pension spending would increase from just under 8% today to almost 12% in 2050. Health spending would actually increase even more, from around 8.3% to over 13% in 2050. So taken together, we're moving from around 15 to 25% of GNI star being spent on these items. And while there are small offsets in other areas, particularly, for example, education spending will be a lower share of GNI star because there'll be fewer young people, this in no way offsets the big impact from pensions and health costs. Digging a little bit more deeply into the rise in pension costs, this chart gives you an idea of the main drivers in billions. So this is the value amounts that are increasing. You can see the dark green bars at the bottom of the part represented by demographics. So you can see a rising, every year there's actually an accelerating trend in terms of demographic spending. You can see the grey bars represent the increase in public sector pensions, which are expected to increase quite a bit in the coming decades and then contribute a bit less. And then the main thing comes from the uprating of pensions each year in line with wages. A notable feature of this chart is the two red circles. So our baseline does take into account the fact that that there are legislated increases in the pension age in 2021 and 2028. So in those years, the demographic effect is actually negative. Turning to healthcare costs, in some ways it's a similar picture. We see the same role of demographics in pushing up healthcare. We see a number of other cost and demand factors are also pushing up on health costs. Those include pay costs. They include non-pay costs, for example, the rising costs of pharmaceuticals. And there's also an income effect, which reflects the fact that as people grow richer, they tend to demand more healthcare. So if you take those together, there's this constant, fairly constant fiscal pressure coming each year from higher healthcare costs. And of course, that corresponds very much to what we've seen in the last few years in Ireland, with quite a lot of pressures, ongoing pressures every year in the health area. As a result of these spending pressures, if they're allowed to play out under current policies, a large deficit would build up, particularly from 2040. So that, starting from balance in 2025, this deficit would gradually build up, and it would exceed 5 or 6% by 2050, but it would also be continuing to be increased at that point. So this position would be inherently unsustainable. And turning that into debt terms, and looking at the chart and this upper line that shows the level of debt would fall, but it would fall fairly slowly. It would reach a trough in the sort of 2030s, but after 2040, it would rise from this 90% trough to around 110% of GDP, and it would be on an upward path. This would leave the debt to GNI ratio at a vulnerable level at all times, and also would put it on an unsustainable path, and this would require policy action. This chart is also broken up to show the impact of aging costs compared to a baseline where these aging costs wouldn't rise. So you can see that in the absence of aging costs, debt would actually represented by the dark green area, would actually be on a steady trend down to around 40, 50, 60% of GNI star. But because of these aging costs, that reduction that would otherwise happen is frustrated and is basically blocked up by these aging costs. So this really illustrates how aging costs make a huge difference to the long-term fiscal outlook. Now, some of these debt projections and thinking about 2040 and debt levels and things may seem very remote, but actually these pressures are going to come very, very quickly, and this is a way of looking at it. In the past few years, we've been used to thinking about fiscal space as being the amount that sustainable growth naturally generates every year, and that's represented by the dark green bars here. But if you look at it, there's also another concept. That's the cost of standing still, of continuing to implement current policies as healthcare costs increase and as aging take hold. And that's represented by those pink dots. And as you can see, each year, the cost of standing still in the future is going to exceed the amount of revenue that the economy naturally generates. This is the reverse of the situation that we've seen in previous years, where each year the amount of annual fiscal space was above the standstill. So we could meet all of our existing commitments, and then there was a discussion every year about how we would spend the extra 1 billion or 2 billion. But this is the opposite of that, because the standstill costs exceed the amount of fiscal space available. To maintain a constant budget balance, tax increases or spending cuts would have to be made to bring the two back into balance if you wanted to maintain balance. So this is a radical shift in the way budgeting is going to work in the coming years. This requires some policy strategies to meet these future needs in a sustainable way. And there are basically two approaches here. One is to increase taxes or adjust other areas of spending more widely. The second is to make changes within the pension system, to raise the retirement age, to raise PRSI contribution rates, or to reduce benefits or coverage. And so these are the choices that politicians will need to make in the years ahead. Allowing the pension age to follow rising life expectancy would make an important contribution to improving sustainability. So this chart shows life expectancy at 65 as the light blue line, and the pension age at the pension age at different points in time. You can see that in 1980, after the reduction in the pension age, the area in between, which represents the expected period people would be in retirement, would be drawing on a pension, widened significantly. And since then, since the pension age was maintained constant as life expectancy was increasing, the time people could expect to spend in retirement was gradually increasing. Now, since the changes in the pension age were made, and assuming that they're followed through as we do in our baseline, you can see that the number of years in retirement remains more or less constant over this period. But since there are no further changes planned after 2030, again, we'd be in this environment of rising retirement, which obviously adds to the costs of the system. So we think an important avenue is implementing the already legislated pension age rises and allowing future increases. So the chart on the left compares the costs of not raising the pension age compared with the cost of following the baseline. So the initial cost, the cost of, for example, delaying it in 2021 is between 500 and 600 million. And that's the pink bar that you see at the beginning. If the change in 2028 wasn't made, that would add further to the costs. And there would be further savings that would be made if a further adjustment was made in 2040. And that would be in line with a strategy of basically increasing retirement age by 2/3 of the increase in the life expectancy. So that basically keeps the balance between people's working lives and people's retirement roughly the same proportions. And when you look at the charts on the right for the debt level, you can see the impact that this has. Following the baseline is what we've already shown you. It shows how debt GNI star reaches around 110%. But by raising the pension age in 2040 in line with this maintaining the same proportions, that would lower the extent of the reduction. However, if the pension age isn't increased at all from its current level, the debt ratio would reach 130% of GNI star. So this very much adds to the unsustainability of the situation. Looking more broadly at the fiscal policy response that might be needed, as well as pensions, it may be necessary to draw on other strategies, for example, raising taxes or reducing spending in in other areas. This strategy basically involves running a bigger budget balance, putting debt on a stronger downward path, and that makes it easier to absorb the extra impact, the extra pressures that are coming from the demographic and health pressures. And the key point here, which is what this slide makes, is earlier action and more prudent policies would ease this future adjustment. So looking at the left, we've made some scenarios. The lighter pink ones are to stabilize debt at 90%. The lilac ones are to reduce debt to hit a 60% target in 2050. Now, if you look across these different scenarios, you see that acting early, so basically taking some fiscal action to reach this target by 2035, if you compare that with the bottom, which is doing nothing until 2035, or an intermediate, more gradual policy, you can see that the amount of fiscal adjustment that's required if you do it earlier is much, much smaller than the amount that's required, particularly if nothing is done and action is delayed until after 2035. And looking at that in terms of the debt ratio, you see how acting early puts the debt ratio on a lower path and makes it much easier to absorb these later pressures down the line. Let me finish with a little discussion about risks. Uncertainty around any long-term projection is obviously massively high, and that's something we very much emphasize in the report. There are many uncertainties about growth, about participation rates, about demographics, and this chart on the right gives you a sense of that. So here we show some scenarios in the report around our baseline. One optimistic scenario where productivity grows very fast, but where employment also grows very fast, and another one where those dynamics are reversed. And you can see the range of debt ratios is enormous, but you can also see that basically in all cases it follows a version of these similar dynamics where it reaches a trough and then it starts to creep upwards or to move upwards very quickly in the later years. But there are also 5 key risks that go beyond these just standard economic modelling risks. There's the COVID risk, the reduction in corporation tax, climate change costs, healthcare costs, and interest rates, and I'll go through those in turn. So one risk, the COVID risk, is essentially that if the COVID crisis is more severe, and here we're starting from the severe scenario that we had in the fiscal assessment report, the debt ratio could be much higher at the start than we assuming it's 140% in 2025. This will greatly increase the complexity of dealing with these aging and health pressures in the future. As you can see in this scenario, the debt ratio wouldn't really fall, and it would start rising a little bit earlier as well. So it'd stay very high if this were to happen. A second risk, which we've obviously spoken about a lot at the Council in the past, is the risk of further corporation tax falls. The baseline already assumes some reduction in corporation tax receipts over the next couple of years, but assuming a bigger reduction in line with the Council's assessment of the amount that's potentially unsustainable, so an extra £3.5 billion here, you can see that if that's just allowed to work through with no adjustment, it would add significantly to debt and to pressures in the longer term. And this could come about either because of changes in the international tax environment or because of particular decisions taken by the small number of companies on which Ireland has corporation tax receipts are fairly heavily dependent. Another risk comes from the fact that one of the key parts of these scenarios is that the debt dynamics at the moment are incredibly supportive due to exceptionally low interest rates. So if this continues, we have the scenario that we've discussed, and in particular, the growth rate is much higher than the interest rate. And in terms of the debt ratio, that's very, very, very supportive to getting debt down. But this could change, and it shouldn't be taken for granted. And so the exercise on the right looks at an upward shift in interest rates of 1%, and you can see that does add significantly to debt and makes the dynamics more complicated. Healthcare costs are a very difficult area to predict and to understand. And so on the left-hand chart, we show some alternative assumptions. The simulation is in the report of using some different assumptions about how much healthcare costs would increase, and you see that this more conservative assumption, in a sense, gets you a lower increase. And so there's a lot of uncertainty about this, a lot of unknowns, but I think it's important to understand those. There are also a more immediate risk from an unfunded implementation of Sláintecare. So the chart on the right shows the additional cost of Sláintecare relative to the baseline. It shows how it builds up over a number of years based on the Oireachtas report of 2017. So over a 10-year period, this would amount to around an additional $3 billion in health spending. Now, if this was funded in a way, if this was implemented in a way that it was properly funded, through some other adjustment that would allow this to be funded. If Sláintecare is able to deliver on lower costs, this wouldn't necessarily translate into higher costs in the long run. But if it's unfunded, or if the implementation is much more costly, this could add to the health pressures that we've already seen in this report. And finally, there's the issue of climate change. So climate change will make a major impact in Ireland over the coming decades, both climate change itself, but also the need to move away from carbon, the decarbonisation of the economy. And these kinds of costs are likely to be met over the same couple of decades that we're also going to have to deal with an ageing population. This chart shows the level of greenhouse gas emissions relative to the projected emissions relative to the ceiling from the Climate Action Plan. You can see with the light blue parts that there are some areas where action has already been taken, but you can also see there's a large area where measures need to be put into place. And the fiscal and economic impact of these needs to be weighed carefully, and it needs to be planned for in a serious and credible way so that it can be managed alongside the ageing pressures. So let me return to the key messages. As I said, this report focuses on the period beyond 2025. We expect growth to slow and the number of older people will increase very fast. Under current policies, spending growth would outstrip revenue, and this is mostly due to pension and health costs. A larger deficit would build up, particularly from 2040, and without policy action, debt would fall more slowly, would reach a trough around 90% of GNI star, and then begin to rise sharply, reaching 110% by 2050. This level of debt would leave Ireland vulnerable, and ultimately, because it's rising, it will be unsustainable. For fiscal sustainability, tax and spending policies will need to adjust over time. Allowing the pension age to follow rising life expectancy would help, but probably other actions will be required in other parts of taxing and spending. But what's clear is that taking appropriate actions promptly would be less costly. There is substantial uncertainty around these projections, and there are important risks around COVID-19, interest rates, climate change, corporation tax, and health costs. Thank you.